This presentation is about China's Golden Age, including the Sui, Tang, and Sung dynasties from 580 to 1186 CE. The Sui dynasty started in 581 and lasted until 618. It was a reunification of China after 300 years nearly of disunification. China wasn't necessarily in a state of chaos, but it was in a state of shifting empires and kingdoms, multiple wars, etc. So it wasn't a unified territory again until from 221 CE until 581 CE. When the Sui dynasty reunified China, it also reformed land owning so that more equal shares were divided among the farming population. It also completed the Grand Canal and other major public works and reorganized the Chinese government. Yang Jiang, whose reign title was Sui Wendi, is the man who unified China. He was the Duke of the Sui Kingdom and dukedom, and was then able to use his efficient armies to unify the Yangtze Valley, the state of Chen, and a couple of other territories under him to begin creating what eventually became the Sui dynasty in 581. Not only did he have efficient armies, but when he created the Sui dynasty, he took the reign title Wendi, which meant cultured emperor, and he used culture in many different ways in order to create a centralized state that circled around a very specific set of ideas that he administered. His ministers in the bureaucracy justified his every act in terms of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Wendi understood the importance of organization, and he used culture to build and hold his empire by over 30 years, creating a complex government bureaucracy and a legal system that were better than any that Chinese government had had, even in the Han Dynasty up to that date. He also conducted public works, repairing the Great Wall in order to defend the Sui dynasty from northern and western nomadic groups, and he also built the Grand Canal, which took water from the Yangtze River north towards the Yellow River, and in the process made it possible to carry large amounts of tax rice. Tax was paid mostly in rice and other grains at the time. It wasn't paid in cash. And having the Grand Canal, which was narrow but deep and capable of carrying boats that could carry 80 to 100 tons or more of high quality rice, etc., meant that tax rice and other goods and commodities could be moved from north to south and south to north without the danger of going into the Pacific Ocean and the storms that could wreck ships there. So the Grand Canal was a major transportation achievement. It was also a major engineering achievement. Sui Wendi was succeeded by his second son. Wendi had only one empress. He had no concubines because of the promise he made to his empress when they were very young. And so he had a limited sized family, but rather than the first son inheriting, Wendi and his empress chose the second son, whose name was Yang Guan. And they chose him because they thought of him as a moral person. So Yang Guan became the Yangdi emperor, acceded to the throne in 604 on the death of his father. And Yangdi may have been a moral person, but he wasn't apparently an effective commander. There were all kinds of issues, not all of which Yangdi was responsible for himself. However, China ran into major economic problems that apparently came about because of large military problems that may have been, at least indirectly, the fault of Yangdi. In 612, Yangdi ordered his army to attack the northern Korean state of Goguryeo. Korea was broken up at the time into three different states, Pakche, Silla, and Goguryeo in the north. And Goguryeo was the most powerful of them and the one that bordered the northern part of China. So Yangdi's attack was apparently to try and bring Goguryeo under the control of the Sui dynasty. and it failed massively and cost China a tremendous amount of money, people, and weapons. Still, Yang Di didn't give up, and despite his general's advice, he raised taxes and attacked and lost again in 614 and again in 615. So his constant fight against Goguryeo, which was not being successful, was seen by some of his advisors and some of his generals as quite wasteful and foolish. And among other problems, the Zhui dynasty began to fall quite quickly into chaos. So in 617, one of Yang Di's generals and his cousin, a guy by the name of Li Yuan, revolted and captured the capital city of Chang'an. Li proclaimed the Tang dynasty in 617, and in 621 Li then captured Luoyang, which was the secondary capital of the Zhui, thus consolidating his control on the empire and beginning the Tang dynasty for real. So Li was quite successful, Li Yuan, but he didn't rule very long. In 624, his son, Li Shimin, was able to imprison his father and take control of China as the new emperor. So Li Shimin became the emperor Tang Taizong. Taizong was a very effective ruler, although also quite ruthless, as you can imagine. But through diplomacy and military action against the Eastern Turks and the Khitans, he was named by them Great Khan. So as Emperor of China and as Great Khan of the nomadic tribes to the north and west, he was able to create a Chinese-Turkish alliance that controlled Central Asia and the Silk Road. And you can see that here in this map. The yellow part of the map is the Tang Dynasty, and then the stripe shaded part of the map is the territory that Taizong was able to control as the Great Khan, which gave him control of trade and to some degree politics, all the way from his capital in Chang'an to Kashgar and Talas, and all the way to Kabul in Afghanistan. So the Tang dynasty controlled a huge portion of the Eurasian continent. And that also meant that they controlled a huge portion of the trade in the Eurasian continent. So the Tang dynasty lasted from 618 to 907, and it reunified the Zhui Empire, continued many of the Zhui reforms, continued the Zhui legalist tendencies, continued the fact that the capital was in Chang'an, although the Tang expanded and rebuilt the capital in Chang'an in many ways. The Tang also went about what you would expect in the dynastic cycle. They reformed land, giving more to peasants and less to large landowners, in short, trying to ensure a smaller wealth gap between landowners and peasants. They reorganized government and created a new legal system that would last in all of the Chinese dynasties up to 1912. And they instituted the Confucian examination system by which people could enter the government, whether they were aristocrats or not. So here is a series of maps of Chang'an and a photograph on the bottom of the Great Gate. The main gate was in the south, and you can see that there are 5 main entrances. These were all staffed by guards, and the city was surrounded by a wall that was like 10 meters thick and something like 5 meters high. Chang'an was sort of in the center of China, near the Yellow River, but not on it. And Chang'an became not only the center of China, but in many ways the center of Eurasia. And you can see the design of Chang'an up there on the table model. That's really important because if you look at it carefully, you can see that the imperial palace was situated to the north. That's it, right up here. And with the imperial palace in the north, the main thoroughfare to the imperial palace was a 50-yard wide street that armies could march up and down, and particularly when they were called, the Confucian scholars who served the emperor would run up and down this main causeway to get into the palace to serve the emperor when they were called. So Chang'an was extremely well defined or well designed. You can see the walls surrounding this sort of cube-shaped city. These are major gates into the city here. There are also major gates in the walls on either side and on the north ends as well. Those were often not as easily opened. The major sections of the city is sectioned off into 4 main quarters, each of which has a wall around it, and then other neighborhoods have walls around them in order to have defensive facilities for all of them. In these areas, you have various different quarters. So this section right here in front of the Imperial Palace was not a residence, it was the political center of the Chinese Empire. And this was where the Confucian scholars and other administrators and bureaucrats worked in a series of large buildings very close to the Imperial Palace so that they could make the journey there very quickly. Down to the south of that and to the east and west, you have various different functioning parts of the city, homes for scholars and aristocrats and bureaucrats. And then down in the south, you also have sections for temples, sections for inns. Restaurants were invented and used in Chang'an. This is the place where foreigners could be. I believe the foreigner quarter was right in this area. And Chang'an was a center of cosmopolitanism. So you had people from Japan, from Arabia, from Europe, really from all over the world living and working in Chang'an, not just as ambassadors, but as business people, etc. It was also a thriving business place. It was probably the most cosmopolitan city in the world, and it was the center of the largest empire in the world at the time and the most powerful state. So Chang'an was quite important. The Confucian examinations, and you can see them being conducted here. Here are some scholars taking their exams at the desks, and then exams being judged and proctored by examiners here. This is a copy over here on the right of an examination that has been written, and these exams were in 3 different parts. That is, there was a local exam, a regional exam, and then an empire exam. And you kind of had to work your way up. It took a long time. So young children who studied Confucianism, which was the only subject of the exams, would begin reading the Confucian classics as young as 6 years old. They were taught to read using the Confucian classics, which were sort of in an archaic Chinese, very difficult to learn to read. They would read these and memorize them all the way up until they took their examinations. And if they passed, then they would move on to the next level of examination. The local exams were a day long. The regional and the empire level exams were 3 days long. And in them you would write essays, identify concepts, and also make arguments about the meaning of Confucianism. If you passed the 3rd level examination, you became a jinshe, or the equivalent, I guess, of what we would think of as a PhD. And the Chinese emperor would hire you right there at the end of your examination if you had passed, give you a very nice house to live in, salary to keep you comfortable, and then if he had a job for you, he would send you there. If not, then he'd have you wait until he did have a job for you. So this was a way to security, a way to be a part of the government, a way to have power and influence in China, and a way to move your family up in the social register. In fact, anyone could take the exams. You didn't have to be an aristocrat to do that. As long as you could pass, then you could earn these privileges. And if you didn't pass, you did come away extremely literate, capable of reading and writing, and became indispensable to the people in your town or your province. So preparing for the Confucian exams was a way forward for many Chinese all over the empire. And it was the only way into the government bureaucracy. But you also have, in part because of the increase in literacy, because of the exams, but also because of the increase in peace and the increase in economic means, the increase in general wealth, you have growing interest in art and growing capability in art. You have poets, painters, musicians. Chinese music took on its classical form here in the Tang Dynasty. Chinese art and drawing and painting took on their classical forms. Chinese poetry took on its classical form here in the Tang Dynasty. This became the model for Chinese and Korean and Vietnamese poetry and art as well, at least in many ways. And so Chinese art continues to be influential globally. And then the Tang Dynasty also is pioneering, kind of, in the sense that we have an emperor who was female. I've called her Empress Wu here, but she was actually an emperor. There was no real distinction made between a male or a female emperor, and this is because female emperors were incredibly rare. In fact, she's the only one. There has been one other woman who controlled the Han Dynasty for a short time, but she was never an emperor. She was a regent. Empress Wu was she lived from 624 to 705, and she was a consort to the Emperor Taizong. She then married Emperor Gaozong, the next emperor in line, and became his official empress. She provided him with a son and was the mother then of the next emperor after her, the Emperor Xuanzong, whom she actually prevented from ruling for quite some time before he finally was able to take control from her. But by the 690s, she had taken over after her husband Gaozong had died and became empress in her own right. She was a pretty effective ruler. She was knowledgeable about policy. She was a big supporter of Buddhism, and Buddhist monasteries in turn supported her. She was very efficient and quite capable. She's also kind of unpopular in Chinese history, in part because Confucian scholars of the time were quite sexist, and they also believed that a woman emperor might be bad luck. And it's also true that her support of Buddhism led Confucianism to some degree to be eclipsed by Buddhists, and Confucian scholars felt that they were losing their position at court, so they revile her for that as well. Nevertheless, she wasn't an evil empress. She wasn't any worse than most emperors, in fact, and she was probably very effective in many ways. But eventually Emperor Xuanzong, her son, was able to take control from her and then exile her, and I believe eventually have her executed. Still, for a short time anyway, she was the Empress of China, and this is quite unique to the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty is really the classical era of Chinese culture. And because of that, and the fact that both Japanese and Korean cultures developed at roughly the same time, the Tang Dynasty had really an outsized impact on both Korean and Chinese culture. And I've just added some pictures here to show you the connections that they had. And in fact, the map that is here on the right gives you some sense of connection. The Korean state of Goguryeo had a direct border with the Tang Dynasty. It was one of three Korean states, and one state that is questionable, that is the state of Kaya. Eventually Kaya disappeared, and Goguryeo, Pakche, and Shilla sort of fought it out, and Shilla eventually became the state that would unify Korea into a single kingdom. That was later in history. Kaya was kind of a Japanese stronghold, and certainly there were Koreans who were living and working in the government there, etc., but it was heavily influenced by Japan. It may also be that Kaya was the place from which Japan was heavily influenced by Korea, and we do know that to be the case. So these cultures were very closely connected to each other, and they were closely connected to Tang China. In fact, Buddhism moved from Tang China into Korea. Confucianism moved from China into Korea much earlier, but Tang Confucianism had a much greater impact as Korean society really developed and organized itself. And Buddhism went then from Korea to Japan, and eventually the Japanese also went to China to find more information about Buddhism. And you can see many of the Chinese influences in these pictures. You can also see many of the Chinese influences in these pictures of Japan. Buddhism, as I said, moved from Korea to Japan, but the Japanese also sent many missions to Tang China and Song China afterwards to get information about Buddhism. Many Japanese monks went and studied in Buddhist monasteries in China and then brought back Tiantai Buddhism. They brought back Chan, or what they would call Zen Buddhism. They brought back various different kinds of Buddhism from China and then developed it further in Japan. There were Chinese monks that came to Japan as well. You can also see that the design of Kyoto here is very similar to the design of Chang'an, and that's on purpose. The Japanese emperors were using the Chinese model of an imperial city in order to make a point that they were emperors under, in this case, the Japanese sun goddess, but still using Chinese geographical design to try and make the point that they're imperial. Japanese law also reflected the Tang law, very, very similar in many ways with the Taika reform. So Japan also heavily influenced by Tang China, and Japanese music as well. Classical Japanese music and classical Korean music reflect Tang classical music in many ways. And in fact, the closest connection that we have to Tang era classical music is no longer in China, it's in Japan and Korea. Buddhism, as we've noted, is important. So just very quickly, the period of fastest growth of Buddhism was actually in the period between the Han Dynasty and the beginning of the Zhui. Buddhism became Sinified in that period as Buddhists moved into China. It also became a political tool because Buddhism was equally appropriate to either Chinese or non-Chinese culture. And it provided an equal chance for salvation, even to middle and lower class people, to Chinese and nomadic people. It didn't matter who you were, Buddhism offered this equal chance of salvation. It also focused on equality, kindness, charity, the value of human life, faith and devotion, all things which Tang emperors claimed as the values that they held that made it important for Chinese people to follow them. And so Buddhism was not only a religion that was popular in China, but it could be used by the Tang Dynasty to claim that the emperor was helping move people towards Buddhist salvation, and that the emperor shared these values of the Buddha, and in fact may be a Buddha or a Bodhisattva himself. And this idea spread to Japan and Korea as well. In fact, various different Buddhisms moved into Japan and Korea from China. Mahayana Buddhism is the form of Buddhism that moved into Northeast Asia. It's one of two main branches of Buddhism. There's Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. And Theravada Buddhism mostly found in Southeast Asia, not completely, but mostly. But Mahayana Buddhism is the form of Buddhism that you find in Tibet, Mongolia, China, Korea, and Japan. It emphasizes a kind of individual salvation with the Lotus Sutra as the center of Buddhist belief for Mahayana Buddhists. The Chinese reinterpreted Indian ideas that had become Mahayana Buddhism, and they created various flexible different forms. So there was Tiantai, Chan, and monastic Buddhism, and we'll look at those. Tiantai, or in Japanese Tendai Buddhism, is an esoteric form of Buddhism. That is, it involves secret knowledge that can only be gained by membership. So for Tiantai, salvation is available to any who join the sect. Joining the sect means that you get initiated into the secrets of salvation. And part of that involves reading and understanding the Lotus Sutra. Part of it involves meditation and various different practices that lead to enlightenment. And because you have to spend time learning to read the sutra, meditating, and learning these various different ceremonies and practices, it can be very costly and time-consuming to be a Tentai Buddhist. So this tended to be the province of monks and people who were wealthy enough to take the time and not have to work all the time so that they could study Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism, on the other hand, was a sort of populist form of Buddhism. It was designed to be available to everyone. It was focused on a salvation figure, and that would be Amida and other bodhisattva who were assumed to be like Buddhist saints who could help guide you towards salvation. And to become a Buddhist under the Pure Land system, all you had to do was sincerely desire to be a Buddhist and to call on the name of Amida as often as possible. Or in the case of what is known as true Pure Land Buddhism, to with complete sincerity call on the Buddha once in your life with the desire to be a good Buddhist. And this simple statement of faith gains you salvation in the sense that if you are truly sincere about your desire to be a good Buddhist, then despite the fact that you may be a working person or a farmer or someone who's unable to spend time reading the sutras and learning the languages and learning the secrets, etc., when you die, the Buddha will come and get you, Amida will come and get you, and bring you to what's known as the Western Paradise, where you can spend time in a kind of intermediate ground, doing the meditation and learning the Buddhist principles before eventually reaching nirvana. So this can be done by anyone as long as you're sincere about your desire to be a good Buddhist, and that makes it possible for even working people to become Buddhists. Chan, or in Japanese Zen Buddhism, is again a little bit different. It focuses on meditation. That meditation is enabled often by practices or koans. Koans are riddles that are designed to occupy your mind so that you lose your sense of self and instead focus on the meditation and forget even the reality or your own individualism. They have a great Taoist influence in Buddhism, and the ideas in Zen Buddhism are a return to nature and to simplicity that are reflected also in Taoism. Even though Taoism is a separate religion, you can see the Taoist influence from Chinese culture here. Chan, or Zen Buddhism, is often also a little bit magical in its sense, and the idea here is that if you are properly erasing yourself, your individualness, then even if you meet death, it's really nothing more than stepping over a line, and you shouldn't see a difference here. So Chan or Zen Buddhism is really quite different than the others, but they're all forms of Mahayana Buddhism. Finally, there's monastic Buddhism. Monastic Buddhism is the gathering of Buddhists in monasteries, monks in monasteries, and these monasteries would work for their own survival by growing crops and creating various different goods for sale, etc. But they also used their storehouses as banks and warehouses, particularly along the Silk Road, for merchants who were traveling or who were sending goods and money for trade along those areas. And they also worked as inns for these merchants, and that gave them a little bit extra opportunity to profit and then use that profit to buy the food and goods that they needed so that their monks could meditate and read the sutras and spend most of their time preparing to enter nirvana. The monasteries also operated as societies of equality, kind of outside the bounds of regular Chinese society or Japanese or Korean society. You could even find equality between the sexes and certainly equality between different classes of society in these Buddhist monasteries. And then for many people, particularly merchants or wealthy aristocrats, when you felt it was time to begin thinking about what would happen to you at the end of your life, you might join a monastery and bring to it much of your wealth as a donation when you become a member. And those donations would also help the monasteries support themselves, again, so that monks could work on their salvation rather than spend a majority of their time finding food, etc. So you see the movement of Buddhism and the importance of Buddhism in East Asian life, both economically, religiously, and in terms of politics. The Song dynasty in 960 was in many ways a kind of retreat from the size and trading interests of the Tang. You can see here in the map that the Song dynasty is quite a bit smaller than the Tang, and much of its history was a history of contraction. So you see more and more warfare with the Central Asian groups and less cooperation and interest with them. And this coincides with a decreasing interest in Buddhism, and growing interest in revival of Confucianism, etc. Although certainly Buddhism is still important, as you can see with this Buddhist figure here. You can also see that the Sung dynasty is a culturally rich dynasty. Literacy grew here, the importance of the examination system grew, and China developed a large and growing publishing industry as well. You also have a tremendous amount of art and intellectual advancement, including science. In fact, the Sung dynasty is characterized by a return to a kind of human-centered worldview from the magical and religious-centered worldview of the Tang. And you see here a renaissance in art and literature and knowledge. They developed technology, not only maps and star charts, but as you can see down below, water clocks, sophisticated shipbuilding, surveying techniques, algebra, the use of zero, and even moved towards an indigenously Chinese developed kind of calculus. So the Sung dynasty was a time of great development. They also developed gunpowder weapons, including rockets, cannon, and muskets that they were able to use to develop a kind of firepower strategy to hold off the larger armies of the Central Asian nomadic groups that would occasionally attack.